Okay. I don't know the clicker, but that's all right. Awesome. So, thanks for having me here. Olivia asked me to talk at this meetup, and I was really pumped up because I am a massive fan of growth hacking. So we, as a company, we started about 5 years ago, and growth hacking was a big way that we got to speak to our clients. And we also use growth hacking a lot on the campaigns that we do. So what I'm going to talk about today is programmatic advertising. Now this is a term that's kind of been thrown around a lot lately. So essentially what I'm going to go through is 6 of the lessons or rules that I've come across over the last 5 years in running campaigns that you guys can hopefully take on when you're doing these types of activities. The title of the topic is How Can Machine and Human Work Together to Predict Your Next Purchase? And I think that's an important one to focus on because Programmatic makes a lot of big calls. Like they really put themselves out there as making some big promises, and a lot of the time they really fall flat. You've probably heard that mantra, programmatic, right place, right user, right message, right time. So we notice that this is often not the case. What you actually find, and there was a study done by AdClarity where they analysed 22 million creatives. And they basically found that out of that 22 million creatives that are running in programmatic RTV environments, about 78% of them were static, generic ads. So whilst we're all saying right message, right user, right time, there's a huge difference between who's actually doing it and who's not. So I'll dive into a few of these now. One of the things that this industry is full of is what I call distractor metrics. So these are metrics that sometimes originated from publishers and aren't necessarily aligned with advertiser goals. So one of the big ones that I've noticed flying around at the moment is this concept of viewability. So maybe I'll actually get a show of hands here because I haven't been to one of these meetups before. Who here's role is mainly to do with marketing? Okay, cool. And who here's role is mainly to do with IT or product? Nice. And everyone else came for the beer and pizza. So awesome. So viewability is a topic that I wanted to cover because recently I was involved in a bit of a LinkedIn argument. So essentially what happened was that one of the heads of trading at a big agency promoted an article that they had written up that was a scientific study, and it was called Programmatic Targeting for Dummies. So I decided, you know what, I love an easy read, so I clicked on it, and what it was a scientific study where he analysed 6 DSPs. So DSP is a demand-side platform. Basically, it's a piece of technology that optimises the placement of ads within an exchange. So that was all good, it's getting better. But the metric that he used to analyse these DSPs was viewability. And if anyone doesn't know the definition, Google defines viewability as 50% of the pixels loading within your browser for a continuous 1 second. Okay? So you have to be a pretty vigilant customer to notice that, and there's a lot of issues with the whole concept. Everybody has a different definition of viewability. For instance, a video view in Facebook is viewed as 3 seconds, and in Snapchat it's 1 second. So there's a huge range here. So what I wanted to do was run through a little test to see how effective it is. So, did anybody see the ad on the right-hand side? Okay, was it Samsung? No. Or American Express? No. Okay. So we'll go back. It was Amex. No one guessed it. That's okay. It was a pretty hard test. We're going to try again, and I'll give you some warning now, and see how we go. Did anybody see the ad? No.
7 News.
So, what was it?
7 News.
No, so that was, I think, the publisher. But things got really weird, to be honest, and this was a bit of a trick, because now they're adding viewability metrics to something called native advertising. So if you haven't heard of native advertising before, it's actually ads that appear within the natural environment of the page. Alright, but what they're actually doing is counting views of an ad that's meant to be in disguise. So it's getting really spooky now. I'll go back to show you. It's hidden in the middle there, that's sponsored ad by Sherman's Travel. Okay? So, yeah, pretty tricky. So the point I'm trying to get to is, even though we're evolving and we're starting to be able to count and track more, we are, in some capacity, starting to digress into metrics that just aren't important. So it got me thinking, in a more philosophical landscape, if an ad loads in a browser and no one is there to notice it, does it really matter? What I'm going to do is probably chuck this down, because it's annoying everyone and me, and we'll just keep on going. Cool. Second lesson learned. Plan by goal, not channel. Now, this is a more technical audience, so this might seem obvious, but you would be amazed at how often this doesn't happen. So what we've traditionally done is we've planned by channel. And for a long time, this was a really effective way of doing things. So in the early 1900s, there weren't many channels around. So you could promote whatever you wanted, and you would get a great result. So who took advantage of this in the 1930s? Cigarette companies. So in the 1930s, some of the ads that were going around were by viceroys, and they'd promote these outdoor banner ads, basically with endorsements like, as your dentist, I would recommend, viceroys and so on. Massively effective. Okay, nobody's actually put the link together. There would be an interesting study for Kashir maybe about the link between the advertising community and death, because we played a pretty big role apparently in addiction during those years. So it was working amazingly back then, but let's have a look at how it's working now. Does anyone remember this guy?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you've probably seen him when you're driving along on the maybe the Parramatta Bridge. He kind of stares at you and tells you that are you feeling sleepy, and basically he's meant to entice you to want to buy his mattresses. So you can see that it's slightly less effective these days, and I think that the reason is that we're still doing this whole plan by channel thing because it's simpler. So an average media plan done by agencies usually has publishers on one axis and time on the other. That's a kind of standard media plan. And basically I want to talk to you about a framework that's a little bit different, that's focused on objectives. So we're going to scrap this model, and yeah, to give you a point actually to just reinforce how much channel is not the most important metric today, about 85% of all digital ad spend ends up with Google or Facebook. So that's a massive number. What it means is that your channel differentiation is not very different to your competitors. And everybody is essentially buying off somewhat the same inventory. So now what's important is actually what you do with that inventory and not where you are. So what we did is we looked at how you can plan by mindset. And it wasn't groundbreaking. Essentially what we looked at was the basic marketing 101 funnel. So we sliced it up into all of the possible objectives that a campaign can have. We looked at awareness, engagement, leads, direct response, acquisition. There's one extra one under there, which is loyalty. So it's essentially any of the above objectives for your existing customers. So we created a bit of a framework here to analyze that, and here's a kind of view of what that looks like. So now on one side we've got the objective, and it's essentially the mindset of the audience that we're talking to. And channels become less important, but on the right what you'll see is that the metric, there's a specific metric assigned to each layer that defines what, whether that layer is successful in achieving the goal. So anything that happens before a click, we call awareness, and it might be a viewable impression or it might be a completed view of the video. Anything that happens from a click on but before personally identifiable information is captured, we call engagement, and obviously leads, direct response and acquisition. So it's a structure that allows us to move away from defining our media plans by channels, which is really something that favoured publishers and agencies, but not necessarily the advertiser. At the end of the day, our customers are probably doing everything, and we need to be agnostic in how we communicate with them. So it's a bit of a change in how we do things. Number 3, so segmenting your customers and your audiences. Gil talked about this a fair bit, and to his point, I think that for the most part retargeting is done pretty badly. So we took a different approach here. When we talk about audiences, I guess there's new audiences and audiences that you have some data on, or at least behavioural data, so from a retargeting standpoint. So when we look at segmenting our audiences, we define that by looking at 6 dimensions of what a prospect has done on the website. So the 6 dimensions, or these audience signals that we're talking about, are broken down here. Essentially what we do is we analyse the product that they showed the most intent in buying, based on what they looked at and how long they looked at it, the stage of the funnel that they got to, and we'll tag them as basically being, in a simple way of thinking, cold, warm, hot, or existing customers. And that infers sort of how we bid for them, what urgency and what creative they see, source of traffic that they came from, interest we can infer from other publishers that they visited, time in which they took that action. We'll slice it up maybe into a 1 hour or 6 hour or 1 day or 7 day window, and touch point. How many times did we interact with them and on what channels? So what you get here is a interesting framework for creating combinations. And these combinations essentially allow us to assume less, and we're often surprised by the results. So the idea we're trying to get to is moving from cookie pools to ponds. And here's a bit of a view, a live view from a customer, where essentially here you can see 2 dimensions in action, stage and time. Now, this was for an OTA, and basically what we did from a stage perspective is that if they landed on the homepage of this online travel agency site, we tagged them as cold once they left. If they did a search for a destination like Hong Kong or Bali, they were warm. And if they actually started filling in their flight details, they were hot. If they already bought a ticket, they were customers, we negative pixel them and they don't get retargeted again. Now, we would imagine that those that actually got to the very end of the funnel, those that started filling in their flight details in a 2-day window, would have been the best audience, okay? So we retarget them with the highest urgency and show them the best possible offer. But actually what we found was that the warm audience within a 30-day window achieved much better conversions than the lower CPA. So it's not to say that that's always going to be the case, but it's that the framework allows you to basically learn what works for your audience and your products. So I guess taking it further, once you've segmented your audience, then you can start to do a lot more innovative things in this space. When we talk about programmatic advertising, what we're really talking about is programmable advertising. So this happens a lot more in the owned space, particularly with automation companies like Marketo and Eloqua and so on. It's not happening enough in the paid media space. So what we want to get to is a place where you can define your audience as perhaps being a 7-day window warm audience that interacted with travel and lifestyle websites, and they also saw a search ad and so on. They may want a specific creative tailored to them. And the idea for marketers is to be able to know what the framework is so that you can set the rules and test different things. So when everybody talks about A/B testing and so on, usually they're talking about testing creative. What I think is more important is how you test creative against audiences, and look at those differently, because testing two types of creative on a whole audience is very different to targeting specific ones. So here's an example with HBF. For instance, if they just land on the home page and leave, it indicates perhaps that they're at the very early stage of the funnel, in which case branding messages and a certain variation can be tested against them. As they look at more product specific, then they can go down to product message. And if they're looking at a particular type of cover, we can analyze, for instance, what type of audience they are, and dynamically inject the type of cover that's going to be most relevant to them. So it's a way to do things, basically create one-to-one marketing at scale, and essentially at the moment, really the only ones taking advantage of this are e-commerce sites with hundreds or thousands of SKUs. It can be used by basically any company or organisation to make their marketing more effective. Number 4, attribution. And I've put here that attribution is a point of view. I think there's another saying that, or an opinion rather, and I want to talk about that because there's a lot of ways to cook it and cut it, and it's important that we kind of know the difference. So in the display marketing world, usually conversions are counted based on a attribution model that is either post-click, post-view, or a combination of both. Just because there's a mixed crowd here, who understands or doesn't understand the difference between post-click and post-view? Anybody? Yeah? Alright, I'll just quickly explain it. So essentially post-view means that an ad loaded in the browser, and when I say loaded, for instance, it might be in Google's definition for 1 second for 50% of the pixels in the ad itself. So it loaded in the browser, you didn't click on it, but you somehow converted along the, in any other source within a set period of time. So you viewed the ad and then bought in another time. Post-click refers to where you actually clicked on the ad and then converted within a, in another channel. It doesn't necessarily matter. But as long as the cookie can track you, then you will get the credit, basically. So what we did was we looked at a e-commerce client of ours, and basically we analysed how many of the sales are recorded in different windows. So what you can see here is that from a post-click one-day standpoint, you get a very low number of sales. Okay, most people don't actually click and buy straight away, right? It gets higher in a 7-day window, higher in a 30-day window. But what happens from a view window is that the numbers get really massive. So from a post-view 1 window, you're already almost 3 times higher than post-click 30. And then it gets higher post-view 7, post-view 30. So as an industry, the default that advertising has fallen back on is that we should basically take post-click 30 and post-view 7 and add them together. So I'm not saying that this is the wrong model, but it definitely is important as marketers to understand what the ingredients are and the definitions, because one of the biggest things that I see, and I review a lot of different proposals and audit reports throughout the year, is that often marketers don't actually know what their attribution model is, which seems like it's actually a really weird thing, but it's very common in the advertising space. So imagine if it happened in the finance world and your investment manager basically told you what the returns were on your investments, but they didn't tell you which currency it was in. Okay, your numbers could look a lot better than they necessarily are. So it's really important to kind of understand that and balance it. One of the other things that we look at when testing out which attribution model is the best for our clients is around time lag. And this is an interesting one because you start to see patterns that tell you things about your customers. So In this first one in January, for instance, we had a lot of conversions that happened at the very beginning, and then it sort of lulled away. So basically, from a post-view perspective, people saw the ad and converted in a one-day window or less than a day. But then it also started to peak up at 7 days. So we had this weird U shape. And particularly for this client, it was an e-commerce client, a premium appliance brand. And it told us something about their customers, that they had those that knew what they wanted and wanted to convert straight away. But then it also had those that maybe needed to think about it, and it was a bigger purchase, maybe consult with the boss at home and kind of, you know, get an idea of what they wanted.
Back onto the other one, why was post view sort of so much higher than the post view? Because surely that shows far more intention than clicking.
So on this slide?
Yeah.
So what's the question?
Like, I just didn't follow properly, but like, someone that's clicked has got, I think, like a much higher intention to purchase because used. Why is post view so much higher?
So it's a good question. Basically, it's a lot easier to manipulate the numbers from a view perspective. All right. So what you actually get in a market that's relatively small traffic like Australia is the ability to show virtually everybody an ad if you want to, particularly when you've got retargeting going. So, you know, and particularly when you're buying on platforms like Facebook, where the majority of your audience is, and when you can buy on the right-hand side where the cost of that inventory is really low. So one of the things that we look at when we're auditing reports is the ratio of post-click to post-view conversions. Because if that ratio is really out of whack, it tells you that there's some manipulation of the data, or it's not really reflecting the true analysis of where credit is really due. And I think that there's a lot to be said about, you know, the things that aren't really attributable. There's a lot of assumptions that have to be made and things like that. But definitely, if we're talking about it from a minimizing error basis, the error magnitude gets greater. The greater you move away from the true goal of you as an advertiser, the greater the error and the cost. So what I would say is when you're assessing the performance of your campaigns, you should always look at the post-click and post-view conversions separately, and a safer metric to know whether you're performing well is to really just focus on post-click, because as you said, it shows you much higher. A few other things that we see a lot of these days, particularly from various agencies, is different ways to obfuscate the data and different reporting magic tricks. So some of the top ones that I've come across, totals only. Okay, so no spend or CPA, basically just big round figures. Is it good? Is it bad? No one knows. Another one is graphs only with no trend analysis on them is a big one, and also selective timeframes. Okay, so that's another big one there. So these are a few red flags. One that actually came across recently, I was speaking to a client. They basically had us go through their reports, and what we saw is this totals only type thing. So there was no spend or CPA. I looked at it and said, okay, great, we can figure it out. It's, you know, clicks times CPC, we'll get spend, divided by conversions, we'll get CPA. Send me the data. But the response was, oh no, our agency told us that Tableau only produces PDFs. So one of the things is, you know, there's a big hype around data management platforms and, you know, companies wanting to, you know, build out these big, robust segmentation engines and things like that. At the very basic, you know, simplest state of being, you need to understand and be able to edit your reports. So that's kind of a key one for us. And finally, always on equals always improving. So in the marketing world, traditionally we just built campaigns that were time-based. They were based on seasons and things like that. But what we've really seen is that the ability to stay in market at all times has a huge benefit for you as an advertiser. It also means that you always keep your agency accountable, which is a really important thing. We're seeing that trend now, so performance advertising is not anymore a discretionary expense. It's becoming like search and staying always on. And here's some data from a campaign where they ran 2 time-based types of campaigns and then an always on. And what we found is that when you launch in programmatic environments, assuming that you've set it up correctly, usually the CPA starts to decline, which shows performance, it shows optimization and so on. But when you get out of market, so the difference between campaign 1 and campaign 2, the starting point shoots back up. So you lose a lot of those learnings when you stop and start a campaign. Losing those learnings has a lot of negative impact, obviously on performance, but also on understanding why that happened in the first place. And we saw in the third campaign that if we continued it longer than the periods of the first 2, things really start to light up and the CPA continues to decline, and ultimately you continue to learn more from your campaigns.
So are you saying when you say loss of loss of learnings,
yeah,
is that the main attribution for why it rebounds like that? It's literally just kind of the nuance, the grey understanding of a particular channel or a particular campaign just dissipates over time.
Yeah, usually your insights are not, they don't translate over. There's a lot of other things actually. So when you stop a campaign, you basically stop the algorithms, which are usually based on predictive modelling, from assuming what the next placement should be. And if you save where you were at and try to load it again, you're not necessarily going to get back to where you wanted to. There's also a lot of operational things that happen when you stop a campaign. The teams that were optimizing it move away from the data, and then when they come back, it's at a different place. From an environmental perspective, the bidding prices might be different due to supply and demand within the ad exchanges. So essentially, it's just really poisonous and not healthy for a campaign to do that. There's always going to be seasonality, and we're not saying to forget Father's Day and Christmas and everything else, but we're saying to overlay that on a baseline. So what we see the most effective way of doing things is to establish a baseline where the creative is not it's not tied into the type of time frame or the offer. It can be interchanged based on what's actually current and what's allowed to be promoted. That seems to be working the best.
Who do you think does that well?
As in establishing a always-on campaign?
Yeah.
Benchmark? No. Well, yeah, it depends. It's a really fragmented space, so it's hard to know who's sort of doing it well without making it sort of self-promotional and whatnot. I think that it's more important to know what the metrics to assess your vendors are to keep them honest. So as we've kind of gone through in the reporting, things to look at will help you assess that. We're seeing a massive trend where advertisers are kind of wanting to take a lot more in-house, but taking it in-house doesn't actually necessarily mean building out a data science team and running an internal trading desk. But what it does mean is taking a bit more control over the marketing decisions and the programming of your ads.
So they can be more nimble.
Yeah, like when we went through how audiences interact on your website, you can now use platforms and systems to create rules that show audience A a particular message or 2 messages and test what works best on them. That I think is the next evolution of marketers taking more control of their messaging and so on. Yeah. So those are the 6 takeaways, yeah, really I think that the very first step in making a successful campaign is knowing the definitions and what the ingredients are to make things work better. And ideally see the light in performance. So yeah, had to put that in. Cool. Any questions? Nah, great. Thank you.